morning, ladies and gentlemen. That's another installment of the online edition of the course on the history of Western family in 18th and 19th centuries. Last week we talked about companionate marriage. Today I'd like to talk with you about child rearing, motherhood, parenthood in the 18th century. What is really important to remember is the concept of the return to nature. This was one of the concepts proposed by a French philosopher, French language philosopher. He was born in Geneva, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And especially important for our discussion today is his book published in 1762 called Emile or On Education. You'll get the link. So Rousseau was a theoretician of family life, you might say. He was definitely credited for raising the interest of the reading public in family matters, in education, and especially what is called the child-centered education. That's the kind of education that really focused on the children, their natural curiosity, their playfulness, rather than making them learn from books from an early age. Why did Rousseau think so? He believed, and he wrote in his philosophy, that man was created perfect, and only social interaction, man's meddling with nature, spoiled his perfection. So he believed that the best that humans can do is to return to the state before civilization, to the state of nature. He was quite fascinated with the stories circulated about geographic exploration, about the encounters with exotic peoples, tribal societies, especially in North America, the Native American tribes. So he started to believe in the concept which he called a noble savage. A noble savage was someone who was spared the bad influence of civilization, so he lived in the state of nature. To a smaller extent, the concept of the noble savage in the 18th century could be also extended to country people, to peasants. So we have certain interest in the life of country people, but for most of the rich reading public of Rousseau and his contemporaries, this was quite superficial. But this is why in the 18th century you have aristocratic ladies and gentlemen dressing up as shepherds and shepherdesses and playing in the fields, pretending to pasture sheep, because the idea, the philosophy was that you should return to nature. Of course, the idea of companionate marriage was also to some extent connected with the return to nature, and the idea that marriage should be based on love and friendship rather than money and business transactions in terms of dowries and exchange of titles was more natural, was considered more natural than the traditional marriage arranged by the families. So how did it all reflect on children? I'll be using mostly the information from a book that was originally written in French by a French historian and philosopher called Elisabeth Badinter. The title of this book is The History of Maternal Love. It was first published in 1980, and Elizabeth Badinter poses a very provocative question. Is maternal love a subject of history? Is it a question of nature or culture? And she believes that, of course, there are some natural propensities in many people, although perhaps not all people, towards parenthood, towards fatherhood and motherhood, but maternal love is not an instinct in a biological sense. So it's not something that is common to all people or even all women, and that is before culture. So culture strengthens maternal love, and she believed, Elizabeth Badinter believed, that she could actually trace it through history. And for her, the most important moment is the publication of Rousseau's Emile, or On Education, in 1762. So before that, before the 1760s, in the first half of the 18th century, children were seen as a source of fear. If you remember our discussion on earlier dominant modes of family life, during the Protestant period, the Puritan period, children were seen as sinful creatures. The belief in the original sin was very strong, so children needed discipline, they needed to be taught moral behavior, because originally they were believed to be evil, sinful, capricious. There was no notion of special status of childhood. So before Rousseau, before the middle of the 18th century, generally children were considered to be smaller adults, small adults, just smaller, weaker, more stupid, perhaps more sinful. So what they needed, it was believed, it was discipline and instruction. Strict upbringing, physical punishment, caresses and spoiling children was strongly discouraged. They were treated as a burden on family life. Few people expressed their joy of the fact that they had children, especially many children. This was considered an inevitable fact of marriage. Of course, in the time before the state welfare and insurance, children were quite important source of income, especially during illness or later age, but they were seen as a duty rather than as a joy of family life. So those who could, those who had the material means to get rid of the most tiresome aspects of this duty, tried to do that. So especially in France, Elizabeth Badinter mostly studied the situation in France, but the situation in England was quite similar. So the rich sections of the society who could employ servants to look after children did that. So children were given into the care of paid servants, including the so-called wet nurses, that is, special female servants who were hired to breastfeed the children. It was generally believed that breastfeeding was unladylike. It was even believed that it was disgusting and demeaning and animal-like, that women were not cows or sheep to produce milk. And the general medical opinion, until well into the 18th century, was that milk, as any bodily fluids, is produced from blood. So when a baby nursed at his or her mother's milk, they were as if sucking the blood of the mother. So it would weaken the mother, it would make her more susceptible to illness, it would destroy her beauty, it would deform the breasts, and also it would interfere with the marital and social relations of the mother. If you remember our discussion of the companionate marriage and the importance of the intellectual development of women, many women around the middle or in the first half of the 18th century believed that motherhood stood in the way of their intellectual development. It interfered with their social obligations. It separated them from their husbands. Another popular medical opinion of that time was that breastfeeding women should not have sexual relations with their husbands because it would spoil the milk. So that was the situation before Rousseau. In the poorer sections of the society, it was even worse. Many children were abandoned. There was quite a common sight on the streets of London or Paris to find abandoned homeless children. One of the famous charity institutions in London, the so-called Foundling Hospital in London, that was established in the 18th century by a retired sea captain called Thomas Coram, was established precisely to remedy what he believed was a very horrible situation in London, that there were so many abandoned homeless children. The general rule was that maternal love and family love tended to be quite selective, so sons were more cared for because they could bring more money if they grew up, and generally the commonplace belief was that it wasn't very wise to invest emotionally in small children because they died very easily. Actually, Elizabeth Badinter gives some data for France, but then again for England it would be similar. So she has the data from the 17th and the first half of 18th century, and she said that in France 25% of children died within their first year of life, and slightly more than a half reached their 10th birthday. So considering the fact that the situation in England was similar, you had like half and half chance that the child would survive 10 years. So material status, social status did not really help, and the fact of losing a child was a very common occurrence in rich families as in poor families. So many people, many women as well, believed it was unwise to love their children very dearly, because if they died, and this was a possibility, you would be despaired, you would be depressed. It's better to have many children with the hopes that some of them would survive. So with Rousseau's publication, the concept of the return to nature was extended to family life, and many people, especially from the rich and literate classes, started to identify with these ideas and started to understand family as a source of happiness, source of simplicity and nature. So first it was extended in marriage relationships, so there was a, you might say, promotion of loving relationships in marriage, and then it was gradually extended to the children as one of the aspects of the return to good nature. Rousseau used different arguments, so he used the argument of the noble savages, so tribal societies in which it has been observed breastfeeding and child rearing was very close. He used arguments from ancient culture and history, especially the Greeks and Romans, the civilizations that were very respected by his contemporaries. And he found examples that Greek and noble and Roman mothers from the noble families breastfed their children. He also used the animals, but not the animals that were not seen as noble, so cows and sheep, but noble heraldic beasts such as lions and tigers, predators, and even these beasts were seen as being caring and loving towards their offspring.